gentlemen, we will get this first session of a very packed and exciting program off to start. I have been requested by Professor Booth to keep time religiously, so I will do so. Each of our two speakers will speak for 20 minutes. We will then open it to the floor for discussion, comment, and general reviews that go along on these sessions. Neither of our two speakers today need an introduction, but I'll give them one anyway. Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, Professor Ole Wæver from the University of Copenhagen. Professor Mearsheimer will lead us off for 20 minutes, and then followed by Ole, and then we'll open the floor. Professor Mearsheimer.
It's a great pleasure to be here to honor Ken Waltz, who is clearly, in my opinion anyway, the most important international relations theorist of the past 50 years. It's a great honor to be back at Aberystwyth, which of course has a long and rich tradition of producing international relations scholars. It was also the home for quite a while of E.H. Carr, another great realist thinker of the 20th century. I also think it's quite amazing that it's here in Britain that Kenneth Waltz is being honored in Britain, as you all well know. Not a place that has been particularly receptive in recent years. And I think it's a testimony to Ken Booth and to all of you as to how open-minded you are. That you're honoring Ken today. What I wanted to do was talk about the rational actor assumption, or the lack of a rational actor assumption in Ken's work, which I think is a subject of great importance that has not been explored in any meaningful way by most of his critics or those who analyze his work. And I think it is of great importance for understanding the guts of his argument and how it really works, and for distinguishing him from other realists. I also think it casts some doubts on different aspects of the theory. So what I'd like to do is just briefly lay out my understanding of his theory, focusing mainly on the rational actor assumption, and talk about three possible implications. As you all know, Ken's theory starts with two simple assumptions: that the system is anarchic and that states are mainly concerned, although not exclusively concerned, about their survival. And from that, he deduces that states care greatly about the balance of power. Very importantly, he does not seem to argue in his works that war is a smart strategy for acquiring more power. His books and his articles and talks place much more emphasis on maintaining one's position in the balance of power, place very little emphasis on acquiring more power. And he certainly believes that states should not pursue hegemony. Too much power is a dangerous thing in Ken Waltz's world. The whole idea of maximizing relative power is antithetical to his way of thinking. But very importantly, he does not seem to believe that war is a smart instrument for acquiring power. I have a number of quotes from his writings that I'd like to read just to drive this point home. Force is more useful than ever for upholding the status quo, though not changing it. Writes, before 1789, war may have been good business. It has seldom paid thereafter. As I pointed out in the paper, those of you who read it know, I cannot think of a single war that he has endorsed And I'm not talking about wars that he experienced in his lifetime. I'm talking about wars in the modern historical era. I talked about Bismarck, for example. One of Ken's heroes, I think it's fair to say, is Bismarck. And he wished there were more Bismarcks in the historical record. But when he talks favorably about Bismarck, he talks about Bismarck after 1870, not during the 1860s when he fought 3 wars and turned Prussia into Germany. He's basically silent about Bismarck's wars. I think it's quite clear that, number one, he does not believe a state should want to pursue hegemony. And number two, he does not believe that war is a good way of changing the balance of power. But of course, the problem that he faces is that if you look at the historical record, there are lots of wars out there, and there's a good number of cases where really powerful states tried to go for hegemony. So of course, if you have a theory that's based on an assumption and a set of arguments that say that pursuing hegemony is a bad idea and fighting wars to gain more power is a bad idea, and that doesn't mesh with the historical record, you can't have a rational actor assumption, and you can't pretend that you can explain state behavior, because you've got all this evidence of great powers behaving in ways that don't mesh with what's happening in the international system. In other words, there's just lots of empirical evidence that would contradict his theory if it was based on a rational actor assumption. You all understand, and this is something that many people in the United States don't understand at all, that if states behave the way Ken says they should behave, in other words, if states were rational actors, it would be a remarkably peaceful world. The reason that the world has such a rich history of trouble is because states have not acted rationally. Domestic politics has trumped strategic thinking. So he can't have a rational actor assumption. In my world, right, it makes good sense for states to behave aggressively. In his world, it does not make good sense for states to behave aggressively. In fact, as I said at the end of the paper, as those of you who have read it know, that his theory would be a terrific normative theory if people were to accept his line of argument and behave rationally. Because then we would have very few wars, and it would be a very peaceful world. One other dimension of this that bears mentioning. You understand that because Ken Waltz says that he cannot explain the behavior of states, therefore you need a separate theory of foreign policy to do that. Anytime a country like the United States goes off the rails and fights a war in Vietnam or fights a war in Iraq, it makes no sense. It does not count against his theory because he does not have a rational actor assumption. He's not surprised by the fact that the United States is mired in a quagmire in Iraq. He's not surprised by what happened in Vietnam because he's not assuming that states are rational. And he can't assume that states are rational because he sees all this behavior out there that is at odds with his theory if it were to be predicated on a rational actor assumption. For me, on the other hand, because I have a rational actor assumption built into the theory, Iraq is a strike against me. Vietnam is a strike against me. So you see how important this rational actor assumption is. One could argue it's an escape hatch. I wouldn't argue that. But the point is that Ken is not claiming to explain individual behavior, as you all know, probably better than I do. He's trying to explain outcomes. Okay, let me raise what I think are the three potential problems for his theory. I'd be very curious to hear what everybody has to say about this, especially Ken. Three potential problems that I think grow out of the fact that he does not have a rational accurate assumption. First is, if he can only explain outcomes and he can't explain behavior, he then has a theory that can only explain a small part of international politics. And he, of course, admits this. But he, in his book, goes to great lengths to, I think it's fair to say, bash reductionists. But in the end, because he needs a theory of foreign policy to explain state behavior, which is a huge chunk of the story, he ultimately says that reductionist theories are very important for understanding international politics. Don't want to lose sight of that. He's also, in effect, saying that the structure does not limit state behavior as much as one might think. A lot of structural realists, I think I tend to be in this camp, really do believe that the structure is a straitjacket. The structure is not much of a straitjacket in his theory, if you think about it. Because there is lots of wild and crazy behavior in the system, according to his theory, that can't be explained by his theory. Point one. Point two is that he argues that I'm not trying to explain state behavior. I'm trying to explain outcomes. A few big and important things. And this is a perfectly legitimate argument, of course. But the question you want to ask yourself is that if you have a theory that cannot explain the behavior of the great powers and implicitly allows for lots of wild and crazy behavior by great powers, then how is it going to reliably explain outcomes when outcomes are the result of the collective behavior of the individual states? Right? Because these outcomes are supposed to be rational outcomes, right? State X may go out and do some wild and crazy things, but in Ken's story, the system ultimately punishes those states for misbehaving, for acting in suboptimal ways, right? You get punished. So the system, in a certain sense, is very rational in the end. But the question I'm raising is, should we expect the system to be rational if the states that comprise it are so often behaving in irrational, suboptimal, whatever you want to say, kind of ways? So let me give you an example of this. The system punishes people, punishes states big time in Ken's story by balancing against them when they misbehave. Balancing, as we all know, is central to his story. But balancing assumes that states that are threatened are going to behave in smart ways and form balancing coalitions and pursue smart strategies to deal with those reckless states that are on the march. But the question I ask you is, if you have a theory that eschews rational behavior and says that great powers often behave in foolish ways, how can we count on balancing to work? What about war? Let's talk about war. Ken's basic argument is that he can explain when wars are more or less likely. and it depends to a great extent on the structure of the system. You know his very famous argument, which I basically agree with, that bipolarity is more peaceful than multipolarity. Therefore, it's hardly surprising that we had 2 world wars between 1900 and 1945, when the world was multipolar, and we had no great power wars, no war between the United States and the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1989, because the system was bipolar. The question you want to ask yourself is, first of all, should there be any wars at all in history? Why should there be any wars? There shouldn't be wars in bipolarity, there shouldn't be wars in multipolarity. He's told us that war is a foolish way of doing business. Well, if war is a foolish way of doing business, there just shouldn't be any wars since 1789. That's one puzzle. Second puzzle is, if you look at World War I and World War II, these are 2 cases where Germany went on a bender. Right? It decided that it was just going to go off the reservation and behave in wild and crazy ways and try to become a hegemon, which contradicts Kent's theory. Okay, but it wasn't multipolarity that had anything to do with the war. It wasn't structure, right? It was the fact that you had wild and crazy leaders running Germany in 1914 and again in 1939. And presumably, if Otto von Bismarck had been in charge in 1914 and 1939, you wouldn't have had a war, right? So it's domestic politics that comes racing back in a really big way in his story. See, again, not to talk about my own views, but just to talk about my own views for the purpose of contrasting with Ken's. For someone like me who has a rational actor assumption, I have to be able to explain World War I and World War II as rational wars. Right? Otherwise, I can't have a rational actor assumption. That's why that rational actor assumption is so important. Final point I want to make is that if you think about it, how you, as a rational state, should behave in a system that's filled with reckless great powers, or where there potentially might be reckless great powers out there, is different than how you should behave if you're dealing with another rational actor. Okay? And Ken's basic worldview is that states that are rational should not behave aggressively. They should not go to war. They should not be risk takers. Leave that to the wild and crazy states, who of course in the end get decapitated because balancing takes over. Of course, I've raised some questions about whether balancing will work. I'm not sure that's the way you want to think about how to act in a world where there are reckless states out there. I think if you're operating in a world where you're leaving lots of room for reckless states, states that don't behave according to rational actor precepts, that you want to be especially powerful vis-a-vis your adversaries. This is if you're a rational actor. And you should be willing to pursue risky strategies to gain more power, to protect yourselves. Protect yourself. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you're dealing with a reckless state, you're dealing with Adolf Hitler, he's going to be almost impossible to deter because he's reckless by definition. So the more powerful you are, the better off you are. Because you want to make it as clear as you possibly can to Adolf Hitler that aggression does not pay. Let's just talk about preventive war. If you believe that you're operating in a system where great powers might be reckless, which means deterrence, good old-fashioned rational act of deterrence might not work, you want to be very, very powerful. You want a wide power gap between yourself and any other state that might be out there. And you really begin to think about preventive war. Think about 1936, when Hitler reoccupies the Rhineland. You had to do that all over again. Wouldn't you launch a preventive war knowing what you now know? Think about the rise of China. If Ken's right that there are all these reckless states in the system, that they don't behave rationally, and you see China rising, and you're not too sure how to think about it, but you know there's a reasonable chance it might be reckless? Oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell you, balancing? You're going to depend on a balancing coalition to check China? What if those potential balancing partners behave in strategically suboptimal ways and can't be counted on in the crunch? Don't you want to be so powerful that you don't have to depend on these potentially undependable allies? So you see, it's like playing poker, right, with a rational opponent versus playing poker with an irrational opponent. You might want to think differently about how you operate in those two contexts. So the argument that I'm making here is that in a world where there might be reckless states out there, and he leaves lots of room for reckless states in his story, I think it's not clear that you want to just sit back and wait and depend on a balancing coalition to pull your chestnuts out of the fire. I think there are going to be powerful incentives in that world to behave very aggressively just to protect yourself from that reckless state. Thank you.
And absolutely bang on 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you for the chance to participate here. I appreciate this, not only for the obvious reason that this is an incredibly interesting group of people, and it's a great chance to honor the work of Kenneth Waltz. I also have my kind of personal reasons to be excited about this, because I have written now a paper that I've been dreaming about writing for a very long time, but I've really had no possibility of doing it because it doesn't fit in anywhere. In a time when we are asked to be relevant and useful, it's not very welcome to write a paper not only about theory, but about theory of theory. And in addition, whatever credibility I might have left among reflectivists and post-structuralists, there's no really place where it's very helpful to reveal how Waltzian I really am. And then thirdly, the neo-realists, as you will find out, will hate the paper too. So the only way to present that, we need to go to Aberystwyth, of course. Most of the papers here naturally open with reference to Waltz 1959 or Waltz 1979, which is pretty obvious given the conference. But I'd like to start with its reference mainly to Waltz 1994, 1996, 1997, 2003, and 2004. The point being that Waltz has answered critics in recent years increasingly in terms of the question, what is theory? The poor critic who's lectured in all these answers and earlier answers to critics were previously told that they had misunderstood factual features of world politics. Then in the middle period they would be told that they had misunderstood specifics of the theory, but now increasingly people are told that they have misunderstood what theory is at all. And also, we should really not be very surprised about this, because if you read in Theory of International Politics and in various interviews, Ken says very clearly that the major move that enabled theory of international politics was to think deeply about the what is theory question. Quote, In wondering how to develop a theory of international politics, I spent a lot of time reading the philosophy of science. I started to read on the subject because I noticed great variation in the way the word theory is used. And yet, the debates on theory of international politics in the 1980s, especially into the 90s, have never focused on this issue, what is theory, and what the implications are of this. Debate have mainly taken place at two levels. Those who focus on reality, saying international relations doesn't look like what this book is saying. Or second, in terms of social theory, in terms of structure agency debates, the concept of system, and so on, but not theory. And the third round of debate, the one we're mainly having at the moment, is actually even more puzzling. Current debates around the work are mainly internal debates among neo-realists these days. You can take maybe two sub-branches. One is trying to go further into the kind of mechanics at the core of the theory, and you have the debates over offensive versus defensive realism, how exactly to spell out the core mechanisms. Or you have all the theories that want to add unit-level variables to make it also a theory of foreign policy, the neoclassical realism debate. What is funny about those debates are that they are all dancing around all the theory, but none of them really says what the theory is. It's not only that they're not clear about what theory is, but they're not really clear what the theory is, what is it really that Waltz's theory is saying. They never really spell out what it is that they want to modify. So there are all these modifications, but it's not clear to what. Why is that? It's because I would claim that everyone assumes that somehow the theory is a formal proposition of some kind, that this is the basic format. It's not a law. If you read chapter 1 of Theory of International Politics, you couldn't call it a law, but then it's some kind of super law or some kind of other form that can be put into propositional format. And people can't really find it because that's not the form the theory has. So my intervention here will be to point out the importance of the question of the structure of theory. Not the theory of structure, which we've talked about previously, but the structure of theory. And here especially to emphasize the importance of Waltz's definition of theory as a picture mentally formed. So the main part of my presentation here is to spell out what is Waltz's kind of theory, which I of course partly do by just finding bits and pieces in the writings that we, in a sense, already should know, but also by linking it to philosophical literature on the structure of scientific theory, where there's a long and complicated argument about the semantic view, the syntactic view, non-statement views of theory, and the role of models in theory, and so on. And when I hopefully get through that, I think there are some insights from that beyond understanding the theory of a more kind of history of science, sociology of science, nature, where we'll be able maybe to place theory of international politics a little more precisely in the history of the discipline and explain why it had the effects it had. And to make that sound a little more exciting, I'll sum it up in terms of why Waltz succeeded only with 5 out of the 8 revolutions he attempted. And that should then lead into a suggestion for, in a sense, redrawing the battle lines in IR, getting beyond what I've previously called the fourth debate, the rationalism reflectivism debate, and saying that maybe when we have been recapturing what I take to be the radical anti-empiricism of Waltz's theory, it becomes clear that maybe the most important battle line is one between empiricism and theory. So, in that sense, it's clear that the level that I'm trying to place this debate on is slightly different from the one that where we previously had the most theoretical debates about Waltz. Obviously, a lot of the debates were those that, in a sense, converged into Bent's social theory book, all the debates of structure agency and all that. And that has, in some sense, been seen as covering the level of theory and grand theory discussions and so on. But at the level of philosophy of science, we haven't really been discussing similarly intensively. There's only been one kind of fragment of a debate, the attempts to use Lakatos and discuss Lakatos's approach in relation to the theory and so on. And for reasons that I don't think I need to spell out here, that is a very limited, very particular debate that doesn't fill that whole space, and there are also reasons to, there are limitations in Lakatos's theory as such, which basically is kind of rational reconstruction, a kind of analytical philosophy and historical ropes that has definitely its limitations, and I think therefore we have a big terrain that we haven't covered yet. In the paper, I first have a section where I look at this in kind of general terms, which I just mentioned here in bullet points, of saying, well, it would be easier if in some sense you could just label Waltz and say he is at something in philosophy of science terms. And people have done that. There are 4 labels that have been around. He's been labeled positivist, Popperian, pragmatist, or scientific realist. The fact that you get all 4 is already revealing that probably none of them are going to work to get that kind of diverse collection. Positivist is clearly the most common. If you did any search, that's the word that has been used most often. It's also clearly the most mistaken. I don't think I even need to explain why. Popperian has been argued most clearly by Hans Moritzen. You can also make some good cases why there are some basic metaphysical realism. There's attacking positivism, empiricism, inductivism, and so on. But there are big problems in relation to testing and falsification, where it's very clear, and Waltz has been very explicit of saying that it doesn't follow Popper there, which after all is such a central part of Popper that really makes the definition rather problematic. Pragmatist is what especially Charles Jones has argued. I think there's some very good arguments there, but in the end it's really one argument for where you should have gone and really arguing that where it was. And fourthly, scientific realism. Well, maybe no one has really labeled all that, then I should maybe do it, in the sense that I think actually there are good reasons why you can see the logic of the theory being very close to scientific realism. It's very fashionable these days to draw scientific realism increasingly into the discipline, or critical realism. But there are some clear parallels here that Waltz is searching for mechanisms of a non-observable nature that are always present, last and late, but only sometimes materialize. These forces are emergent qualities at a higher social order. There are various things that actually, where you could kind of read Roy Mascar and Ken Waltz much closer to each other than the way we usually discuss these things. There are reasons, of course, why people don't do that, and that's because of the terminology that Waltz is using. He's clearly not using the terminology of realism. He's very key on stressing that these are analytical categories, they're not real, and so on. But I would argue that is maybe not so terribly interesting. It becomes a very religious discussion about whether you should use scientific realism as your language, but whereas the structure of the argument is actually pretty close. So I would say you could actually make a very interesting argument, try to argue that Ken Waltz is really a scientific realist, critical realist. But anyway, my main lesson from this section is basically that Waltz doesn't fit in to any of these. So we don't find out his kind of theory by saying he's one of those. And that is really also what he's saying himself. He's saying, I read all of this philosophy of science, and then he's picking out bits and pieces, searching for where there's something to be used, not by signing up to some kind of school or branch thing. And also there's good reason for it, as Waltz has correctly observed. Instead of the logically prior question, what is a theory, most of the philosophy of science literature deals with the testing and not the meaning and making of theory. So, and then he's added in another place that it was a good chance to read the philosophy of science, which is a great literature, not to have to read a lot more political science, but I think you'll leave that aside. In any case, in theory of science politics, Waltz is emphatic about the importance of theory. It's the first word in the title, it's the first word in the preface. The purpose of the book is set out in terms of theory and so on. And it's also clear that the great success of the book and its project has a lot to do with the way it was widely accepted as setting a new standard for theory in the discipline. And given all of this, it's surprising how little attention has been paid to what is actually said there about the nature of theory. And I think my main possible here, and I think something that we have to draw conclusions from it, is the way that the American mainstream today increasingly, at the same time, acts in a way as if Waltz has set the direction to follow, and increasingly they're moving in the opposite direction. Increasingly, they even Waltz's own students and students are following rather a kind of King-Johann Weber form of science, which is what Waltz explicitly is criticizing. So in that sense, I think it is really important to recapture what is actually said there, because there's a big puzzle or paradox how you can, in a sense, shape the whole discipline by throwing in this bomb, and everyone, the whole discipline, as we would agree, rearranges its fronts around. This book is really throwing in theory, and then everyone rearranges it, everyone relates to it, but actually you're doing it in a way where you don't follow that idea of theory which was in the book. Now this is the puzzle that I'm trying to find a solution to here. As we know, Waltz is very clear in the book saying that a theory should not be used synonymously with law. It's something that explains laws and explains in general. You can't arrive at a theory by just collecting hypotheses and so on. We have to work with models. Those models don't mirror reality. The models are models of the theory. The models are invented to represent theories. You have to come up with suggestive ways depicting the theory, not the reality. And the model then presents the theory with its theoretical notions omitted, whether through organismic, mechanical, mathematical, or other expressions. What is then a theory? And there Waltz has a very specific formulation, which I think most people just will, with the teeth first, puzzle a bit, read it 3 times, and then try to forget it and read on. He says, a theory is a picture mentally formed of a bounded realm or domain of activity. A theory is a depiction of the organization of a domain and the connections among its parts. And then there's a reference to Boltzmann, misprinted spelling in the book, but still Boltzmann, 1905. That quote contains at least 3 important and controversial elements. First, there's the idea of bounded realm or domain of activity. That raises the whole discussion about whether international politics can be isolated from economics and culture, and Busan, Goddard and Nixon. Lots of people have written interesting stuff on that. Secondly, it stresses the active element. It's mentally formed. There's a creative element. That's an interesting line. But thirdly, there's the interesting formulation about a picture. The theory is a picture. Here the reference to Ludwig Boltzmann is relevant. He wrote in 1890, I'm of the opinion that the task of theory consists in constructing a picture of the external world that exists purely internally and must be our guiding star in all thought and experiment, that is in completing, as it were, the thinking process and carrying out globally what on a small scale occurs within us whenever we form an idea. That was an argument made in a very specific context as a solution to particular dilemmas relating to the ontological status of atoms. A realism, instrumentalism debate in physics at the time, where Boltzmann tried in a way to find a kind of middle course of how to think of the atom, whether it was real or it was a model and so on. The Bild theory as such was already around, and it went on from him with some influence into Wittgenstein and so on. We don't get a lot from following that track at first, I would say. I would say there's another literature in philosophy that is probably more helpful here. There's been a big discussion on theories, where the core idea is that in a sense, before thinking about this, we all assume in a commonsensical way that theory are an interpreted set of actions and derived theorems, what Frederick Suppe has called the received view, others call the syntactic view, or the statement view. So that there are a set of actions and theorems, basically, and up against that was put the argument, which is called the semantic view. A specific branch of it is the structuralist approach, the non-statement view, increasingly a model theoretic approach, which is to allow in non-linguistic, extra-linguistic elements in the theory. So the point is, until around 1970, it was taken for granted that for philosophical purposes, scientific theories are to be thought of as interpreted formal axiomatic systems. So they are statements that are in principle either true or false. That's the core of the theory. And therefore also science are ultimately linguistic representation. There can be no fundamental role for non-linguistic entities. Then the newer semantic view saw it as a collection of models or a specification of a class of models. That debate's become easily very technical and in some ways not really as important as it first looks. But then it has been picked up again more recently by people, especially people coming from cognitive science, and I think given it a rather interesting twist again. For instance, Brian Gier has presented a model theoretic approach where it's argued why visual models of various kinds are to be taken serious. And in that sense, the ultimate relationship we're dealing with here is not between language and models and objects, but between a relationship between two non-linguistic entities. That is a relationship between a prototype and instances which you take to be where you can use it. This, I think, is a very interesting position in theory, because when we talk about theory, there tends to be a big divide in the discipline. And I think some of us have experienced that in very practical senses. Barry and I can tell anecdotally about when we wrote the book Security, a New Framework of Analysis. The reason the book is called A New Framework for Analysis, or not necessarily anything with theory, is that it was published in America. If we publish it with a European publisher, it would be called a theory. In Europe, you could call this a theory, but if you send it to an American publisher, they'll look and say, where's the causal error? What is the dependent and the independent variable, and if it isn't there, it's not a theory, so we call it a framework for analysis instead. So there's a big divide. Everyone in America is assuming the theory is of that one particular kind, whereas in Europe you go to the other extreme of saying, well, a theory is just any kind of connection of concepts that are somehow tied together. And that is, on the other hand, very, very wide and loose. And I think actually this argument that comes from this literature of thinking about the models that are actually explanatory is in some sense trying to overcome, or could help us to overcome this. So I think it has really big implications for where we stand on this theory discussion in this. In the paper, and I think I have to speed up a bit here, I spent a bit of time looking at the current debates among neorealists, neoclassical realists, the various kinds of realism and so on. And what is interesting here are that there people are all the time calling for specification of the theory, and we know Waltz's answers at one level there, but we've missed the other half of the answer, I think. Whenever people just say put more into the theory, we know we get the answer that because something is important doesn't necessarily mean that it should be in theory. But the other half of the answer to those critics is that you should make a clear distinction between the theory as such and the usage, the applications of it. That all the specifications come in when you use the theories. Whenever you make predictions with a theory, you bring in reality. All the reality that you don't bring into the model, you bring in whenever you use it. You're going to need a lot of information and judgment and so on. As a quote, all theories don't predict, people do. So in the sense that there are all these things you bring in at that stage. And this whole specification debate, I think, is the key to seeing what is going on at the moment, where we're having a debate that I think is becoming more and more unhelpful, where we get this very trivial setup where it sounds as if it's just a trade-off. You can have some people who go for parsimony and then have less explanatory power, and others who have less parsimony and more explanatory power. And then it becomes more or less a kind of personal choice, where it's just that Waltz, for idiosyncratic reasons, prefers to be far out in one extreme, and others might go to the other extreme. But that doesn't capture the whole argument, because Waltz's argument would be you don't get more explanation by going that way. You actually get less explanation by having less parsimony, because you don't have the core of the theory intact. I then use as an illustration of how debates are unfolding at the moment Randall Sreller's unanswered threat, which I think about a characteristic example of the way current realism works, where the striking thing is that at one level it accepts Waltz's, a basic kind of Waltzian, or with a lot of Mearsheimer in there as well, theory as the theory of the system. And then not only does it add a unit theory, and we know why that is problematic and so on, the interesting thing is that the nature of that unit theory is of a completely different kind of theory. It's the theory of the correlations, variables kind that was denied. So there's no following the guideline for what kind of theory you should build. So I think that there's here a big tension in there. And the second paradox is that there's no clear picture of what the theory itself is. And this is where the reference to Boltzmann and the build theory and so on comes in. It's almost as if current neorealists are ashamed of the fact that they can't find the theory in Waltz, so everyone pretends that they know what it is, because when they look, there is nothing looking like a theory in their conception of what a theory should be. Where are the core propositions? They aren't there. Why is that? That's because of the core of the theory is this picture mentally formed. So the core of the theory are basically those two key elements of what the structure is, that at one level it's the anarchy as a basic idea, and the second level it is the polarity argument. So the core of the theory is this idea, it is this image, this is the structure. It's not propositions. Some might say then the theory is balance of power theory. No, balance of power theory is placed really there in between the theory and the lower-like regularity. The place of balance of power theory in theory of international politics is that there's kind of inherited tradition, the best knowledge we have, and now it can become theoretically guided, because now we can explain these mechanisms. Now we have a theory behind it, and then it comes in as the next element. Then I go into this comparing Mearsheimer and Waever and so on. It's a pity maybe I don't have time. That would be interesting discussion.
2 minutes.
Because it's interesting to see, and you hinted at that in the presentation here as well, how when you put up your theory, you make it in terms of assumptions. You have your famous list of 5 assumptions, and this is how we define the theory. Waltz works in different ways. He doesn't make kind of isolated assumptions. They have to be element of one coherent idea from the start. So there's only really one assumption in theory of international politics, which is the states want to survive. That is not an add-on. That's a necessary element in order to have create the picture at all. You couldn't have the idea of anarchy without that assumption. So it's not that you go on specifying by adding assumptions, which would be the kind of statement view of theories. It is the picture which is the core of the theory. So I think here we are moving away from the Waltzian idea of theory without really realizing that we do it. So the theory should be this picture mentally formed, which is ultimately a graphic thing, and you will then all say, okay, what's the point? What's the point of this picture thing? We know, why should we take it so serious? Because we're having the whole discussion as if it was something else, as if it had the propositional format, and we just haven't really found the right quotation from the book where the proposition can be taken. And this, I think, is important both in order to understand theory, but as I hinted also for understanding the landscape of our discipline. As I've argued previously with these drawings here and how the landscape should be understood, theory of international politics was so terribly influential when it came because it reorganized the whole landscape. Realism was reinvigorated. Everyone else had to relate to the book. Liberalism redefined itself into neoliberal institutionalism in order to say we have a core theory as well, and we had the reflexivists coming in up against this pole, and we got a whole landscape which was in many ways shaped by this. Why did it get the pattern it did? Well, it did that to a large extent because there was a possible synergy between the microeconomic element in theory of international politics, the microeconomic logic of neoliberalism, and the rational choice Waever methodology. And the point I'm trying to make here is that what happens to a book is not the consequence of the intention of the author. You might say with Skinner that is to some extent the intention of the text that matters here. It's a contextual speech act. So what the book did in that situation was different from the intention of the author. It came to shape the discipline because of the constellation of different theories. So where neoliberalism was moving, where the critics were moving and all that, that together gave it the meaning that it got. And that meaning then became that it was the microeconomic element, the possibility to line up rational effectivism that became defining of it. So my main point here at the end is that it's interesting to look at where Waltz succeeded and where he failed. I made then a list of 8 revolutions that are attempted in the book and in the surrounding writings. First, relaunch realism in a scientific format. 2, to stress the need for theory. 3, to create an understanding of theory. 4, the need for structural theory. 5, an appreciation of the importance of polarity. 6, an appreciation of bipolarity as more stable than multipolarity. 7, a warning against unnecessary, wasteful, and counterproductive practices in armaments and interventions, a lot of what Mearsheimer talked about. And a non-hysteria about the spread of nuclear weapons. What's interesting is that the 3 failures are on the 2 policy questions, where Waltz is clearly out of line with mainstream in his positions on policy, and it's an understanding of theory. When it fails on the level of theory, I think Waltz has given the explanation himself. It's the positivist tradition that permeates American political science. And I think this whole story is a proof to how strong it is. When you can celebrate a book and claim that it's the main text, and then still go in the opposite direction of what it says in terms of philosophy of science. That shows how strong the positivist tradition is. You might also speculate that there's a link between the meta theory and the politics here. That when you can't succeed in the politics either, it's also because you really need theory to move away from the kind of common sense role, which also will be closer to the pragmatic, this is the only thing you can imagine. If you're an empiricist, you can never get the critical distance. You will always be too close to the pragmatics of the political situation. So you could therefore make a political case for chapter 1 of Theory of International Politics. We need theory with big T for critical political purposes. So in that sense, where I want to end this is in a suggestion that we should take it as a contingent map that was produced for a specific reason through the 80s and 90s, that we get this line up where we have reflexivist over here and we have rationalist over there, the theory of international politics as a kind of epitome of that position. That is only on one specific line, but you could draw up the main battle line between theory and empiricism, and then you will find very surprising allies, and you will find that it's really possible to see the linkages between part of the reflexivist program and neorealism, which you usually don't think. Usually you see reflexivists and post-structuralists trying to flirt with classical realism and say we can use classical realism against the neorealism. But if you emphasize theory, it's actually the reflexivist and neorealism that together could be pushing for more uses of theory. So maybe we're coming in for a battle line now in terms of theory. Maybe another sign of that, if I can take the liberty in this context to mention another journal than the one we will usually be talking about, the new journal being launched, International Theory, is maybe a sign of theory itself becoming the new frontline.